right? So I'd say if we are thinking about Techne and Poesis and the relationship between the two, we were talking about Heidegger and his famous essay on technology, right? We find that Poesis, what is Poesis? Poesis is related to poetry. Poesis is creativity it's like self-generation, make, in that sense, self-exceeding, in that sense that as he's developing the idea of poesis from ancient Greek thought, what he's saying is that poesis is a ecstasis. In other words, ecstasy in the sense of a kind of a intensity of energy that takes us beyond ourselves. And this is the self-exceeding. And energy concentration and a intensity, an increase in the intensity that pushes us beyond ourselves. It's like, in that sense, like a quantum jump, you know. And for that, what is really happening is that if we think of, he gives examples from nature, okay. But if you think about like the metamorphosis of the cocoon into the butterfly, right? It's it's a kind of a moment of gathering and externalizing as something new, bringing the new to birth. But the new is not brought into birth from something outside. It's from within that it's born. So it's a self-exceeding in that sense. It comes from oneself. But what is that self out of which it comes? That self is a gathering. So when we are talking about certain kind of inner, one may call it an inner ecosystem, we're not just a kind of a resource made up of a certain set of properties of doing, right? We are the cosmos. Each one of us is the entire cosmos. And the becoming of the cosmos is taking place inside us. So if we were to come into contact with that, if we were to come into contact with the microcosm that the cosmos has become in me, right? And if I can gather that, if I can concentrate that in myself, the creative power of becoming in it will produce me as the self-exceeding of myself, not as a kind of a separated being, but as the cosmos itself in a unique form. This is why it's poesis. Poesis. Poetry, in that sense, is always a instance of something cosmic. When somebody writes poetry, they may be writing about a certain theme, but there is a gathering of many cosmic elements that takes place at that point. And the power of a poetry lies in of a poem lies in the fact that as you are reading it, you feel that expansion. You feel the language being able to open up a cosmos for you that came because in its inception, in its poesis, it's this cosmos that gathered itself and came to a threshold point of intensity and became something material. This process, this act, this, becoming, form is accompanied by a certain configuration of forces that can be called technique. It's a technique that you followed and a technique that made, there again, we come to subjective technology. A good poet creates their own techniques. So that's what you actually sense when you do, say, literary criticism. Looking at a poem from the inside, you see how the syntax and the semantics are related according to a certain technology. See, this is techne. So this kind of techne is also the subjective technology of self-exceeding, seen as a cosmogenesis. Self-exceeding is not just individualistic, human potential from the point of view of a kind of a ego drive to becoming, which is a kind of having, becoming at the service of having. That's very easy to, do in our time, mistake in our times, because that's what we're being told all the time, that that's what we're here for. Another kind of technology of truth telling is that if I'm in a state of consciousness, how do I tell truth about it? In other words, not tell truth as truth being separated from what is being told, but how does truth tell itself? Again, we come to poesis. Poesis is that. Poesis is the coming into matter, the coming into expression of truth. This is the difference between if I were to describe an experience to you, and if the experience bodies itself forth to you in language. This is actually also what makes the distinction between a guru who has had an experience, is writing from that experience, and a scholar that is writing about somebody else's experience. You see, so this is the kind of truth and transmission of experience happens through that kind of process. Subjective technology, again, so it becomes technology that is a certain kind of method, but a method that is ultimately mysterious. It's a method up to a certain point, and beyond that point, it's a method that's utilized by the forces of creativity that are part of a self-exceeding, part of another state of consciousness. And we were talking about poesis, we were talking about poetry itself. That is a different kind of knowing, that's a subordinated knowing. Today, in the modern world, in the technological world, the arts have only a ornamental place. They kind of hang in corporate offices as some kind of abstract aesthetics of form. It looks pretty. Okay. It comforts me because it pleases its eye candy. But as a matter of fact, what's happened is that we live in a world in which there's a big split between the masters of industry, the corporate, technological, sort of happy campers, and those who are at war with it because they experienced life differently. And this is not just those who are at war with it because they believe in other belief systems, the belief systems of religion, but those who are at war with it because they have a different understanding of what puts it all together. So the arts are largely a kind of a political stance critical towards the world of technology and capital by and large. And that what has happened is that it has even become cynical because there is no escape. Absurdism is a certain kind of a cynical critical response to technology and to capital. So this war is ongoing, but behind it is this thing that I'm talking about. It's a different modality of becoming. Because if we look again at poesis and at the arts, there is an intuition of the one which is aimed at. There's a way by which, whether we talk about, even from a certain point of view, from the viewpoint of science, Einstein was making a very big case for intuition because he was saying that we don't come, even when we are talking about the laws of the world, right? We don't come to an understanding of the laws of the world by actually studying everything from an empirical point of view and adding them all together piecemeal and make kind of, inductive judgments. He was saying we catch a flash of the truth first, and then we work it out in mathematics. we see a large whole, and then we see it as a certain kind of a mental feel. We actually have a feel for it. It's like a flash of light that something in us contacts, and then we work it out. But this happens at different levels. That's why when we are talking about chakras, right? We can have it at the emotional level. We can actually have that. That's partly what poetry is about. There's a certain feel for the whole. There's a sense of the whole. We have an instinct which tells us about what's going on in the world. So these are all different forms of knowing. And these different forms of knowing have underneath them an intuition of the one. We may turn these forms of knowing into forms of having. That may also, that's also part of the colonization and the capitalist technologization of the world. Yeah. And all that we've talked actually is related to that. When we are talking about poesis as a gathering of the cosmos in the individual, how much of the cosmos can we gather? I mean, it's not a numerical thing. Again, it's a knowledge by identity. It's a sense of the one. you know. And that's what is expressed. I mean, the greatness of a great poem is its cosmicity, is the fact that, the way in which it's put together opens up time and space for you, you know. So that kind of coming into contact with the radically absolute one, that is also at the same time the radically plural infinity of being, in which each thing is the whole.
Yeah, one thing that really touched me in as we were describing these is our tendency to avoid the tendency to simplify truth in something that this level of consciousness or this plane of consciousness will somehow be satisfied with. To me, it seems like the idea is to, or the purpose is actually to make a radical jump to another level, to increase the intensity perhaps of the paradox to a point that you can jump to the bindu, as you said,
Exactly.
and then return.
Even as you're saying it, it's exactly how we started by talking about poesis. It's increasing the intensity of the whole in us so that we jump to another level, another plane of metamorphosis and experience.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you one question which might be very useful for people who develop technology or any kind of creative endeavor for that point. What would you suggest are ways or things people can explore, including myself, is to increase that intensity? Because I feel like that's the secret sauce. Oftentimes, in any creative pursuit, is how does one bring it to that level where that jump happens?
Yeah. I think the first thing is to prepare oneself to become cosmic. And that implies ultimately, firstly, the faith that it's possible, as we were discussing, that sense that it's already there. And secondly, developing deep relations with what is outside yourself, exactly challenging your own borders. Can we develop a deep relation with plants, with animals, to a point where we really comprehend each other, where there is a exchange of consciousness and even an identity taking place. And this can be accompanied by specific technologies, or it can just be the will. It can be an anupaya. It starts with a certain kind of a faith, but it is fueled by the emotional will to deep relation. So I think in building that, I think even with respect to the crisis that we are experiencing right now, to accept that complexity that is around us, and to, from within, it's not an external sort of sentimentalism. It's really a kind of internal opening up of these possibilities in a way in which one develops deep relationality and experiences even before it is expressed. It can be expressed simultaneously with its experience, but experiences it, as an extension, or exactly a kind of a poesis of oneself, becoming cosmos.